Good evening. I'm sorry, this delayed broadcast. I was going to talk about strategies a couple days ago. Had some events prevent me from doing the video. This is in chapter 5 of your textbook. But of course, strategies are something, if you're teaching, you're already using a variety of strategies. I mentioned some in my notes to you for this week. This chapter is full of different types of strategies. Obviously, SIOP by itself does not give you one particular strategy, but it does emphasize you choosing those strategies which are comprehensible, which are meaningful to the students, which build upon their background, and most of all, I think is overlooked, are intellectually engaging and challenging. This last part, I think, is very big with me because I think sometimes, and I've seen in the past, ESL sometimes minimized. People think it's just learning basic English, and that's not all that tough because we've mastered it. But in fact, for learning to be meaningful, it has to have content, it has to be challenging, etc. So when you're dealing with your students in your class, I think it's very important when you take a measure of their backgrounds and other things that are part of this. I mean, it's not just backgrounds, but what their interests are, what motivates them, things that connect with their culture that can show meaningfulness, but whatever it takes. I mean, you may have a student that's very good at loves mathematics, but may not have much English background. That doesn't mean they cannot be pushed to advance quickly in mathematics. Almost like I'm saying that don't let the language hold them back, even when it is holding them back at times. Therefore, getting books and materials in their native language, or having someone who uses their native language or translates, who can assist them or promote their reading or interest areas, is very important. I noticed years ago we had students that were interested in automobiles, and they may not know a lot about, their English may be limited, but their willingness to learn detailed vocabulary regarding automobiles or working on engines, even if they don't know the word in Spanish, but they learn it, but they want to be involved and they want to advance in that area. One of the examples I had from many years ago was a Japanese gentleman whose English was quite poor, but and I had him in a class where he came over from Japan, and he was taking English classes, but he had mastery of English in one particular area where he was better than even native speakers of English, and that was in the area of fly fishing. He knew more about the specifics of fly fishing, which I knew nothing about. He knew about the rods, the rod and reels, whatever. He knew about the tension on of course, he knew it in Japanese, but he had also studied it in English so that he knew the terminology. He knew the mechanics. He knew everything about bait. He knew about how to cast and how to talk about casting his line into a river to go fly fishing and trout fishing and stuff like that. It was really quite amazing, even though his English was really pretty rough. And there was something very special about him. He was just a wonderful guy. He didn't associate much with the other Japanese because his interests were completely different. He was just a unique person on his own. And so that kind of got me to thinking, years ago. I said, you find that which they love and which they're passionate about, and you feed that to them. And learning English almost becomes incidental to that. They learn the English as they're going along. You could go and learn how to be a French cook. You may not speak a lot of French, but as you are there for a significant amount of time, you're going to learn the vocabulary that applies to cooking. You may not learn everything about French, but you'll learn everything about how to prepare the food, how to talk about the food, etc. So I think that's kind of an odd angle to bring up to you, but so often people think that, no, we'll learn the vocabulary, and they'll learn how to do sentences, and we'll just kind of do general communication, and at some point they'll be able to branch out into their area of which they want to find out, they want to be interested in. And I think you got to have the drive to learn the language, whatever language you are learning. Anyhow, that's just a point I wanted to make. I think that if you can feed that fire in the student, you can be very successful. So that's why I want the passion and the intellect has to always be included. Now, also in this chapter, he gives some examples of some teaching. Fletcher, Miss Lee, and Montoya teach classes. And the one thing that I think you can take from this, Mr. Montoya is teaching, I believe he's teaching a class on, I have to look at what he did on his class. He is teaching on geography, I think. Oh, the rainforest, okay. But what's interesting about his, as opposed to the others, is that he asks very intellectual, compelling questions about, like, why are we dependent on rainforests for our survival on Earth? Now, your student may not always be able to handle all the questions, but again, if you're operating in an area where you're challenging them intellectually, they're able to do some thinking. It's going to excite them, because language is thinking, and they'll be able to think in their own language, and then they'll be thinking about how to put those terms, or even if they need help with translation. I've seen students write who are very good students, but they weren't very strong in English, but I could see their ideas. I could see the crispness of their ideas, even though their language was not so crisp, was not so perfect. So that's something, again, I want to emphasize. They talk in here about vocabulary and about the content and language objectives. Again, there are so many different strategies, of course, that we could use to teach. I mean, everything from word walls to, pre-vocabulary preparation. I like the idea of preparing them intellectually for the ideas that you're going to present to them. Now, of course, it depends on the age of the kids and if they're high school and stuff like that, or college. But that you set up a way to build that background, which is that previous chapter, so the student is moving toward the material and what you're going to be presenting. For instance, if you're going to talk about rainforests, you're going to give them some background on information about what's happening in the Amazon with the fires, current events, something about the history and the actual climate of rainforests, the weather in rainforests, and the kinds of animals that live there, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to give them contextual information. But then you're not just going to present information, but you're going to ask them to make predictions. And then you can talk about things like, I predict that in the future, or you can talk about the future tense, or the subjunctive tense, which is maybe there will be or if there were more fires in the Amazon, comma, that's subjunctive, hypothetical, future, whatever, conditional, however you want to call that. And you can make up sample sentences like that so they can see a model for those sentences. So I like to give them a kind of a pattern they can use to make some statements of which they will have ideas, and they'll say, how do I put that in the right, statement? So you kind of prepare those. You think, well, they might answer the question this way, and you give them a model or two they can follow, and just give them some solid ground so they can get their feet solidly and they can perform. And then it's like dancing, you get your balance. You're able to sit there and commit a couple of moves or do a couple of spins or whatever you want to call it. I'm not a dancer by trade, although I study it. And then they get their confidence. They're able to make some statements. And the same thing if you're doing science experiments, hypothetical statements. He said, if we combine sulfur with element X and heat it up in a test tube, it will produce black smoke, or it will produce a purple fume or something like that. But then you talk about the language of science, and then those statements that would be made in making a prediction, you would model those statements. That's I think the key to content is that you think about the things that would be stated, not just the reading, but how a person would talk about it. And you give them samples and maybe do a little video, where students do a little experiment and they can observe them, and then they talk about the experiment. You could use your own students to film the video in advance and prepare the materials. So you can never drive that much space. I mean, you can never divorce language and thinking away from the content, that those things have to blend together, especially when when you're teaching content. So now I've got a list of strategies, which is just basically a monstrous list. I got it years ago, and it just has a billion things, and I may send it to you. It's kind of interesting just to leaf through it and look at it, but you'll probably have to Google stuff to look up more details because it's not exactly an encyclopedia of strategies, but it's interesting. They talk about scaffolding in chapter 5. Scaffolding is kind of what I've just been talking about, is giving people something to hang on to so they can imitate it, they can follow it, and it'll help them be comfortable in performing in English while they're also understanding the content. And I think probably the only other advice is the vocabulary always has to be in context, and it has to be used in context. Teaching vocabulary words totally separate in advance is not particularly helpful. It's much better to have them within context or fairly close to when they're going to come up. I remember I used to read Spanish novels, and the worst thing was having to look up all the words. And I think that the best thing would, if I'd taken them in chunks and it'd been great if I'd had some of the more difficult words already prepared so that when I ran into them, I didn't have to break my pace as much and to actually look up the meaning of the word. That's why good dictionaries that actually give you the proper definition instead of 14 definitions, and then you're not sure which one it is. So in English, you can come into that. That's why I recommended some of those dictionaries that have simpler vocabulary. Also, I have one thing I want to show you that I purchased over the weekend, and that is a brand new Oxford Picture Dictionary called Oxford Picture Dictionary. Now this costs $30, but of course it's much better. It has actual photos and drawings. And it has, here's a mall of sorts, even though malls are kind of disappearing. Here's a good one on people, what they're doing, the body, but also what they're doing at the park. Kind of conversations are going on. Here's a little boy he's using the binoculars to look at birds. And here's a girl running. And here are people doing, is it Tai Chi? I don't know. They're exercising in the park. And so this is much more updated and modern, shows a father playing with his son. And the blanket out there, number 9. Oh, that's his leg. I'm sorry. Some things are pointed out, but it's emphasizing body, but also actions in a park. So it's not just a simple photo. Oh, this is great. Farmer's market. And it has different types of foods. It has general foods. And then this is like a workbook. And you can actually use it like you can adjust and use it like, what are they doing at the farmer's market? What do you buy at the farmer's market? And I really like this. It's I'm sure it's not cheap, but it's got everything about baking and cooking and all kinds of fast food in the fast food restaurant. And I think I paid about $29 for it, but you'd probably get it cheaper. Very colorful. So I just want to health food. Now with Corona, now we have to worry about things like this. I have heard that, as you probably know, since we're online, we don't have to worry about Corona, except, in our own little world. But I hope all of you are safe, and we will continue to march on. I'm hoping I don't become ill during the class or become ill at all, but I teach mainly online, so I should be in good shape. But please let me know if you have any issues, illness, concerns, etc., even though we're online. It's kind of a very weird time in this country. I used to read a lot of Edgar Allan Poe and about plagues, and one of my favorite books of all time is Journal of a Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. A lot of people know about Robinson Crusoe, but actually Journal of a Plague Year is a great novel. It was written as propaganda in 1705, I think, in order to alert the English people to the danger of another Black Plague affecting their country. Now, fortunately, it didn't come again in that way, but it was about the plague of the 1650s, 1660s, and earlier plagues that we know going back to millennia had done terrible. It killed, half the population in some areas. And so having even something like that now approaching us where we don't have a cure, and unfortunately, in my case, it affects people that are older than 60. So it makes me a little nervous. But I'm thankful that it seems to be pretty kind to younger people. So I hope all of you are in that section, so you're doing well. But I would like to know anything you want to share would be appreciated. Okay, well, that's my talk about strategies. I wouldn't try to outline every strategy because there's like 1,000 of them. And I will put the discussion up probably in the morning. Had a bit of a headache, but I'm not sick. I just have a headache. And I wish you all well. Thank you.